This is Nice Guy Eddie, and you're listening to In My Humble Opinion on Rainbow Radio. On this day, the 11th of October, 2016, electionprojection.com shows Hillary Clinton leading Donald Trump 351 to 187. I'm joined tonight by Vandy Beth Glenn, who is a writer at Skeptic Inc., started the Facebook group Transgender Skeptics, and currently blogs on her own website, vandybethglenn.com. Vandy Beth, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So just to start, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I am a Georgia native and a trans woman, and I was involved in a pretty major lawsuit a few years ago, and I haven't really done anything else noteworthy.
Well, that can't be true, because I've read some of your writings, so you do write.
I do write. I blog at my own website currently, and I've been published in a few different books. I'm writing my own autobiography, and I'm also developing a TV show right now.
Cool. And if I'm not mistaken, you had served in the military, is that correct?
Yes, I was in the Navy some years ago.
Well, one of the things up front, and this was the clip that I sent you, well, when I say before the show, I think I sent it to you about 15 minutes ago. But one of the very first issues that I ever got really heated with online, it's probably the only time I think I've ever really argued passionately with a trans person about a trans issue in contention. And this was the lifting of the ban on transgender soldiers in the military. Before I ask you about the clip that I sent you, I was wondering how you felt on that as both a trans woman and former military.
How do I feel about them lifting the ban? I think it's long overdue. Trans people, closeted trans people, historically sign up for the military in higher numbers than any other demographic. But the ban does not make any sense. It especially doesn't make sense in light of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So, yeah, the only thing I would say about lifting the ban is that it should have happened several years ago.
Do you think that in the current, and the environment, well, I can't speak to the military, I know the environment is changing both very quickly and also too slowly everywhere else in society. Do you think under the current state of affairs that a trans person would be able to serve openly and safely in the military?
I don't see why not.
Really? Okay.
I mean, trans people have been serving in militaries across the world for many years now. I know that there has been no ban for some time in the British military. And in fact, one of Prince William's fellow pilots was a trans woman who was a guest at his wedding, which I guess says nothing about their fitness to serve, but speaks instead more to the level of their acceptance by their comrades in arms.
Right.
And trans people serve openly in the Israeli military as well. And from all I've heard, there have been no major issues with that. So I got to ask, what was the argument that you got into on this issue?
And this was this was with Dana Gaz, she was the guest on my very first program, and the clip that I sent you earlier. Did you get a chance to listen to that, by the way?
I'm afraid I didn't. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. We'll go ahead and play it shortly. But this was there was a story on, I believe it was Media Matters, about lifting the ban on transgender soldiers serving. And another poster had basically said, why are we bothering with this? We should be focusing on other areas of discrimination and whatnot. And I think I left a fairly benign comment, something to the effect of, it's not mutually exclusive. We could, do this and do other things. It's not a big deal. And then that was when Dana jumped in. And now Dana is an anarcho-communist and very much an anti-statist and very anti-military. So she basically accused me of wanting to throw trans people into a meat grinder, having an agenda that involved killing trans people. I, of course, got pissed and then started posting some not so genteel things. And we the discussion carried over offline, and we went all through it. But eventually, when I had her on the show, because we did kind of come to some kind of understanding, of each other's point of view, though it took a while. I had her on and I asked her that same question to kind of put it out there, because I thought it was very strange that a trans person would be against it. And, she, again, it's when a cis person is arguing in trans issues, you do have to sometimes tread lightly, but I submitted both then and now that I was arguing for what I consider to be the mainstream viewpoint from the trans community, and that she was the one who was perhaps, in the minority.
Right.
Be that as may, and I mean, I don't have data or anything to prove that. Let me play the clip for you, and because I want to get your take on it. It was a very interesting argument.
The main reason that I oppose this is basically there are no good options, particularly for poor trans people, the type of people that may join the military. They don't have other options in society. Discrimination is still legalized from like coast to coast.
Absolutely.
You can get fired. You can get thrown out of your house. There's rampant unemployment. There is just all this marginalization. You have trans people that desperately need medical care that they don't have access to, so they have to come up with it out of pocket.
Well, but wait a second. But isn't serving the military then an option that would address those, address the unemployment, possibly address the medical side, housing, etc.?
And let's say that we did that.
Yeah.
That would be de facto conscription.
Do you think she has a point?
I think that's a bit of an overstatement.
Okay.
I mean, allowing trans people to serve in the military is part of a more general destigmatization of trans people across the country.
True.
The employment situation is getting better for us across the board. The lawsuit that I won has been a big part of that.
Yes, I want to ask you about that.
Yeah, we'll get to that soon enough. But if there are more options, then there are more options. The idea that a marginalized group will join the military because they don't have any other options, well, that's been discussed for a long time.
Right.
I don't know how accurate this was, but there were people making the case during Vietnam that it was for African Americans and other impoverished minorities who were going overseas to get killed because they didn't have any better employment options.
Okay, so this is an argument that's been made before then. Okay.
Right.
Now, did you buy it in that case, or do you feel it was overstated then as well?
I don't know enough to say.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I would say in this case, definitely.
Really?
Even given that might happen, that trans people might join the military because they can't find civilian jobs, that still doesn't mean it's okay to discriminate against us and prevent us from joining the military if that is something we want to do.
Right.
It's not a jobs program. You wouldn't continue discrimination as an attempt to keep us from being discriminated against in a different way.
Right.
I'm not phrasing that very well, but I think you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense to me. And that was essentially the argument I was making at the time. Although I didn't really have an answer for what she brought up, which is why I like to run that by. I assume anybody who had served in the military and also is trans would have the necessary life experience to answer that in a way that, well, it's a little harder to dismiss than, a cisgender male who never served in the military. I have no basis on which to address her concerns. So yeah, that's interesting to hear you say that.
People join the military for all sorts of reasons.
Yes.
And only a very small percentage of them are actually going to be infantrymen on the front lines, taking the greatest risks. When you join, you can join the military to be a cook or to get medical training or even to be a postal clerk. Every civilian job you can think of, there's an analog for that in the military.
Right.
And if it's something that interests you and you have an aptitude for, then you can find a place for yourself in the military if that's what you want to do.
Sure. Do you mind if I ask what brought you there?
Well, I was in the Navy. I was a naval officer in the Pacific, and when I got out of college with my journalism degree, I looked around at all the entry-level jobs in journalism, and I decided to join the Navy because I'd always loved the ocean. I'd always been interested in naval history, maritime history, and I spent most of my life in Georgia. I'd never even seen the Pacific Ocean, so I wanted to travel. I wanted to see the world, have some adventures.
Right.
I wasn't necessarily looking to make it a career, and I didn't. I was only in for 4 years, but I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything.
Right.
Now it's a cliche about the trans experience that many of us join the military in an attempt to sort of beat the sissy out of us.
Yeah. I mean, no doubt it must happen, but yeah, it does become kind of a cliche. And it's interesting that, and I've only had 2 or 3 guests, but that didn't seem to be the point, the purpose in most cases, at least for the folks that I've talked to. Right.
I mean, I was, obviously I was closeted most of my life. I was suppressing, but not repressing my trans status. I didn't want to transition, and I didn't tell anybody that I was trans.
Right.
But at the same time, I wasn't motivated by, I wasn't really aggressive or seeking to butch myself up or anything like that.
You weren't trying to fix yourself, in other words.
Right. Okay. And I didn't join the Navy seeking to have that experience, because I knew enough to know that wouldn't have worked anyway, even if that had been something that interested me, which it really wasn't.
Right. Now, you mentioned originally looking into journalism. So what got you interested in writing? What got you started in that?
I've been writing my whole life. I've always liked communication. I like sort of the romance of being locked away in a room with not a typewriter anymore, and I'm good at it. I've always loved the English language. I compete in the Atlanta Spelling Bee every year, and I actually make most of my income as an editor, not as a writer. So I'm editor and a proofreader and copy editor. It kind of gives me cover for my natural desire to correct other people's English in the first place. So,
and you caught a particularly interesting spelling error in the questions that I sent you earlier, so that I clearly missed, because I am not a great editor, spell checker, at least of my own work. And we'll have a little laugh about that when we get to it, because
right,
that was pretty bad. Now, so why? Explain to me Fibonacci spiral a little bit, and what's that all about, and where that name comes from?
Oh, Fibonacci spiral is the name of my website, of my blog.
Okay.
And this Fibonacci sequence is a non-random but non-repeating sequence of numbers. Right. And it results from a very simple formula, which is each successive member of the set is the sum of the previous two numbers. So it starts with 1. The next number is 1 plus 0 is 1 again. Yeah. The next number is 1 plus 1 is 2. The next number is 2 plus 1 is 3, etc.
3 plus 2 is 5, yeah.
And it's a pattern that you see throughout nature.
Right.
Like the swirl of seeds in a sunflower is according to the Fibonacci sequence. And I've always loved that it's a simple, very simple formula, but it can result in astonishing complexity, like fractals.
Right.
And I like the idea that the universe that we see today in all of its complexity can be the result of a couple of very happy accidents that cascaded into complexity out of great simplicity. Right. And I've always found that a very beautiful concept. And so I like associating myself with it.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned the lawsuit earlier. For those who want to research this further, that was Glenn versus Brumby. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the backstory of that, and then we can go on and talk a little bit about the impact and how it's changed things going outward nationwide.
I was an editor at the Office of Legislative Counsel at the Georgia State Capitol. It was early in my transition. I was still presenting as male at work, and I reached the point in my transition where I needed to fully integrate my identity. I was coming to work presenting as a male, but I was already presenting as myself in all other areas of my life.
Right.
So basically I had a secret identity, but I wasn't a superhero, so that just wasn't sustainable in the long run.
Right.
So I told my boss, who was the senior editor at our office, what I needed to do. Mm-hmm. And she said, okay, well, I'll go talk to Sewell Brumby, who was the attorney in charge of the entire office. Her boss.
Right.
My boss's boss. And this would have been in September of 2007.
Wow.
And in October, Sewell Brumby called me down to his office and asked me to confirm that I was transitioning from male to female. Mm-hmm. And when I said, yes, that's correct, he said, well, that can't appropriately happen in this workplace. and he fired me right on the spot.
Wow.
Yeah. Explicitly no bones about it, because I was trans and transitioning. Right.
And if I'm not mistaken, at the time, though, was there any anti-discrimination law either at the state level, city level? Did that even exist, though, at the time?
There may have been one at the city level, but that wouldn't have affected the state capitol.
Right, okay. Because it seemed like he was the lawyer. He must have known the law, but all the same, he made it about from what you're saying, it sounds like he made it about as obvious as he could that it's for this reason and no other, which is... Yeah. Kind of how you set up a discrimination case, just saying.
Yeah, well, he did his research. Yeah. At the time, well, even now, there's no federal law, right. Definitely no state law protecting trans people's employment. He did his research, and he found the state of the law at the time in 2007 was that some courts had made pro-trans employment rulings and some courts had not.
Right.
And he just decided to roll the dice. I think he was just so transphobic that he would rather take his chances with the indeterminate state of the law than have me stick around on the job.
Wow. Huh. And I know, I assume because obviously it hasn't gotten to the Supreme Court even yet, 7 years later. So all of the various precedents are set in various state courts, and it's probably a function
not state courts. It's reached the federal appellate court in several different jurisdictions.
Right.
My case was decided in the 11th Circuit, which is Georgia, Alabama, and Florida.
That's a relatively conservative area, no? Or is the court different from the...
No, the 11th Circuit at the time my case got there, was one of the most conservative courts.
Wow. So with mixed precedent, no law, and in a conservative appellate court, I mean, how did you think your chances were going into that?
Not good.
Yeah, it doesn't... I mean, I'm stunned that... So how did it work out? How was it that you were able to prevail here?
We got very, very lucky with our panel.
Okay.
Our case was heard by a panel of 3 judges.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our judges actually was William Pryor, who has a reputation for being extremely homophobic. There was lots of outrage from progressive circles when Bush nominated him to the court. I was wondering
why I heard his name. Yeah, that's the only reason I do remember that. Because as soon as you said that, I said, well, I know the name, but he's not a Supreme Court justice, so why do I know that? Yeah.
Well, he was on Trump's list of potential nominees.
All right, you hear that, folks? So don't keep telling me the parties are the same out there. There's a difference. I don't want to hear that anymore.
A few months ago, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it was, I don't know if you've seen the movie King Ralph.
No. I know it, but that's an old movie. No, I never saw that, though.
The entire royal family of England dies, and Peter O'Toole's character is in charge of finding a new successor to the throne, and his aide has come to him with a list and says, well, I have some names, there are some weak names and there are some strengths. And then he names John Goodman's character, and he says, he's an American. Peter O'Toole says, quickly, tell me the strengths. But when my attorney called me and said that our panel had been named,
right,
he said, well, there's some bad news and there's some good news.
Right.
We got William Pryor. I said, quickly, Greg, tell me the good news.
Jeez, yeah.
But our other 2 judges were Rosemary Barquette and Phyllis Kravitch, and they are rock stars. They're 2 really amazing women. Phyllis Kravitch is, I just looked her up again today. She's 95. She's still serving on the court in senior status. But she's Jewish, and she early in her career she became, I believe, the first Jewish woman, or maybe the first woman and the first Jew to attend whichever law school she went to.
Right.
And then later on, earlier in her career, she helped to integrate a country club that didn't admit Jewish people. So she has, and she was appointed to the bench by Jimmy Carter in 1979. So she has impressive progressive bona fides. And Rosemary Barquette is a former nun who left the convent to go to law school, but also her parents were born in Mexico, or maybe she was born in Mexico. But either way, there's a Mexico connection, but her parents were also ethnically from the Middle East. So when she's a former Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. And when she was elevated to the Florida Supreme Court, she became simultaneously the first Arab American and the first Mexican American ever to reach that post.
Wow.
Which is pretty neat.
Yeah.
But Anyway.
So 2 out of 3, that's not...
Yeah, long story short, I was pretty confident of those two.
Right.
So I thought for sure we'd get a 2-to-1 vote in our favor.
Right.
But then we actually got to the oral arguments. This would have been in December of 2011.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this dragged on for 4 years then, or this whole process, I should say. Wow.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a very slow process. We didn't, it's fired in October of 2007. We filed a suit in July of 2008. We won at the district court level in July of 2010.
And then they appeal.
And they appealed. And then a year and a half later, we went to the 11th Circuit. But we went to the oral arguments. And again, I'm just taking it for granted we're going to get a 2-to-1 vote.
Yeah. And
Mr. Brumby's attorneys spoke first, and he was just pummeled. He was eviscerated, mostly by William Pryor.
What? So, what was the kind of? I can't even really imagine this, because you would think this guy's hoping he's going to get a pretty softball case. So, what were some of the points?
Well, the argument they were trying to make was that they had no trouble with the fact that I was transgender. It was my transition.
Well, we don't mind that they're gay. We just don't want to allow them to be married.
Exactly.
As long as you completely deny yourself, it's okay. We're okay with you then. Wow.
Right.
Oh, God.
And our case, we were making a 14th Amendment claim, equal protection clause.
Right.
And the precedent we were citing was Price Waterhouse, which is a well-known case from 1989. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No,
but
I'm not.
Basically, it's about a woman who was told at Price Waterhouse, who was told she would never make partner because she wasn't feminine enough.
Nice.
Yeah, and she sued and she won, and that was determined to be sex discrimination. So, departing from stereotypes about gender roles or gender expression.
Ah, right. Gotcha. Okay.
That's the takeaway from Price Waterhouse.
Right. The parallel being that she was too masculine and they were claiming you were being too feminine.
Right.
So to speak. Yeah.
Right. And it's, it's an extraordinary case because Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins is the name of the case. And Hopkins was the woman who brought the suit. And Ms. Hopkins was not, she wasn't trans. She wasn't even a lesbian. So that, it's a good case to cite for people who try to argue that trans rights isn't relevant to the rest of the LGBT community or indeed to the rest of the community at large. Because the things that they can go after us for are things that you can go after any man or woman, gay or straight, who's not sufficient. It doesn't meet, he doesn't meet someone else's expectations of what a man or a woman should be like.
Right.
But we went to our oral arguments, and Sewell Brumby's attorney stood up to try to make his argument, and he didn't even finish his first sentence before Judge Pryor broke in. You've got a big, and he said, you've got a big problem under Price Waterhouse. Wow. And they basically just eviscerated him for the next 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, Judge Kravitz didn't have a lot to say, but Judge Barquette and Judge Pryor just handed his ass to him.
Wow.
It was really quite a thing to see, and he was laughed off the lectern.
Wow. Now, did the decisiveness of that victory / loss for the state, do you think that had something to do with why they didn't choose to appeal it further? Because I would assume they could have taken that to the Supreme Court if they'd wished to.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. Yeah.
To know their state of mind.
Okay.
I don't.
Makes sense.
Comfortable speculating about that.
Right. Now this though, and because now this is a clearly a trans precedent, this is now cited citable for other cases. So have you been aware of the impact since that case was argued?
Yeah, it's been a little frustrating because our case never got that much publicity, and I think in the public at large, it's pretty much been forgotten since then. Most people have no idea. Most people I meet, even when we're talking about stuff like this, most people haven't heard of my case.
Right.
The exception would be attorneys.
Well, those are the people who need to know about it, right?
Yeah. Apparently my case is still seen as quite a big deal in law schools, and
Right.
I've had attorney friends bring me in to speak to their classes.
Wow.
And I have friends who've gone to law school who told me that they've spent whole days studying my case, which is very gratifying.
Yeah, that's got to be that's got to be a good feeling. I mean, does that ever just? I mean, because obviously back in 2007, of course, this is the farthest thing from your mind, I'm sure, but does that? I mean, how does that hit you? And just on day to day, you hear about something like that and you go, wow. I mean, to be a part of that. I mean, yeah, it's not well known. It's not Roe v. Wade. It's not, it just didn't get to the Supreme Court. But when a trans case is taken to the Supreme Court, no doubt that's going to be that case is going to be used as at least one of the precedents that they're arguing. Mm-hmm. That's mind blowing. That's wild.
Yeah. Yeah. And you may have, I don't know if you've heard of Macy versus Holder, but
that sounds familiar. I'm not, refresh my memory. It does sound familiar, but I don't recall.
Macy versus Holder was a case involving the EEOC that was decided in April of 2012, so just 5 months after our case,
right?
After our ruling. Oh yeah, and I should point this out too. After we came away from the oral arguments, mm-hmm. I asked my attorney when we could expect a ruling. And this was in December. He said, if they're really, really fast, maybe late spring.
Okay.
Early summer.
Right.
They issued their ruling in 6 days.
Yeah. So the state of Georgia had a pretty shitty attorney here arguing for it. Sounds like. I mean, he didn't get one sentence into it. 6 days done. Wow. That is kicking some serious ass. Wow.
Yeah. When I couldn't believe it when Greg, my attorney, called me and told me that we had a decision, that it was the last thing I was expecting. And I said, is this, have you ever heard of this happening before? He said, well, it was, the turnaround was this fast in Bush versus Gore, but
yeah, that's true. That was settled awfully quick.
Nothing else I know of.
Nothing good. Wow. That's
so. Yeah, but anyway, Macy versus Holder was an even more far-reaching case, because that was the precedent where the EEOC said that they would now treat all trans discrimination cases as sex discrimination cases nationwide.
Right.
Government or private sector workers.
Right.
And Glenn v. Brumby was one of the main cases that they cited as a precedent for it. So, I like to think that our case was an important contributor to that ruling.
Absolutely. Now, I need to ask you for a little bit of speculation here, because I'm politically speaking, and one of the reasons that I mentioned about the parties earlier is I really only have 9 issues, and they're the Supreme Court. That's when it comes to who I'm voting for, and I've said this in the program many times. Those are the only 9 things I care about, are those seats on the Supreme Court. Because in my opinion, if you have that, anything else will fix itself over time. Basically, if you don't have that, that is the biggest roadblock to trying to get anything done. Particularly with the state of legislation being where we are right now, where you just can't. You just have a party that is dedicated to making sure nothing happens. Right. And they happen to control the majority of state legislatures, both houses of Congress, etc.
And that's mainly because of gerrymandering.
Yeah. And that's starting to get struck down. By what? The courts, which is why you need that, folks. Don't think you can accept a Trump or a Republican. Don't believe that for a second. It won't be 4 bad years, folks. It'll be 30. Okay.
Right.
But now you've experienced this from the judicial side, and obviously played a part in making a huge stride forward on that side. And I guess I always wonder if I overestimate the importance of that, because people will argue there are states where you're making progress within the legislatures. Certainly, I think if the Democrats were to gain a solid majority in both houses of Congress, that's a pipe dream, but we might see progress at the federal level. I mean, obviously I'm pretty cynical about that, but, I guess where do you see any good, reasonable chance that something meaningful is going to be done at the legislative level? And I'm talking federally, or is this ultimately something for the Supreme Court, do you think?
It's definitely for the courts.
Okay.
You can't wait for the massive train that is U.S. elected officials to make a 180 on some of these issues.
And this from somebody who was 4 years from event to finish, from start to finish. So
right.
4 years, that's the fast version.
Well, more on point.
Yeah.
I know in your list of questions earlier, you mentioned my speaking to Congress.
I did want to get to that. Yeah, about the ENDA bill.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. In 2009, I went and spoke to the House committee that was considering ENDA at the time.
And that was still a democratically controlled House in 2009, as I recall. Yes.
Yeah. We had a Democratic president. We had a Democratic majority in the House.
Yeah.
We had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate.
For a very brief window of time, but yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I went and I spoke, testified before this committee along with several other people who had some expertise and interest in these issues. You know, there was an EEOC commissioner who spoke about implementation. Barney Frank spoke. Tammy Baldwin.
Okay.
The woman who at the time was the only lesbian in Congress.
Okay.
I believe that was Tammy Baldwin.
Okay.
Anyway, we spoke to all these House members, and they all seemed very concerned and very interested and very motivated to pass ENDA. I shook Dennis Kucinich's hand, and then nothing happened.
Right.
ENDA never even came to the floor.
Right. Now, the version of ENDA, and this is one of the great disappointments of Obama's first term, of the LGBT movement. The HRC was involved in this, and I know a lot of negative feelings from the trans community. The HRC comes out of this issue. When you were speaking this at the time, did this include transgender protections, or had those been left out, or were they never part of it by that time? Do you know?
No, the version I testified for did include protections for trans people.
Okay.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have been there.
Well, I was wondering if you were maybe arguing if they were trying to be put in, or I don't really know the history of it that closely, although the closest thing it became one of the bargaining chips, was that they threw out was transgender protection, and that was something that the HRC at the time was still solidly behind
right.
the bill, and that's unfortunately it ended up going nowhere anyway, and that was just a huge loss for everyone. But now I'm sorry. Before we go on though, did you have something else?
My point was just, ENDA didn't pass in 2009 when Democrats were holding all the power and had all the cards and et cetera, and that's pretty much when I lost faith in the legislature at any level to ride in on a white horse. It's it has to be the courts.
Yeah,
both about trans issues and also Obergefell. That expecting that to happen state by state legislatively, or even at the federal level in the courts, would have meant that marriage equality would have taken probably another generation.
Yeah. And then you look at, and even beyond LGBT, you've got, the assault on women's reproductive rights, the arguments against healthcare, which again affect the LGBT community, but also affect everybody. And yet, God, it's just amazing the amount of damage that could be done by a handful of very bad judges. And as much as I don't necessarily like, or am not a fan of, for example, President Obama's two appointees, nothing comes to mind that I can say that I would disagree with any of their rulings or reasonings thus far in their service on the court.
Yeah.
And the difference between what a Republican, you look at Alito basically picked up where Scalia and Thomas left off. Roberts crossed lines once, basically, on the Obamacare case. And,
right.
And Kennedy is not one swing vote who comes from a conservative background. I don't like those odds. But give me three more Democratic nominees and Scalia and Thomas gone? Oh my God. You could fix everything in a single session. All you got to do is get everybody going, get the ACLU and every other group to start lining up and done. To hell with the legislature at that point. Who cares who the president is, aside from the fact that I want a Democrat appointing those seats, even if they're moderates. Moderates are so much better than the alternative that you would get. And a moderate now in today's society is practically a liberal relative to where the other side is, which is insanity.
This is true.
Yeah.
Was there a question in all?
No, we're just a rant. That's sometimes I just have to hear myself speak. So sorry about that. Now, one of the things I did want to ask you about, because things are changing again, both legislatively, although legislature also is working very hard against at the moment in so many places, unfortunately.
Right.
But I had a guest on from the HRC about a month ago to talk about it was Sarah Warbelow.
Okay.
And I had a lot of questions for her from previous guests that I had on, Facebook friends, etc., who were transgender and who had a particular venomous hatred of the HRC. And she was a sport. She fielded all these questions. She was very solid in answering them. And it left me, someone who has no direct connection to any of these issues, but it left me with a feeling that, oh, okay, we'll see how it goes. Maybe this is going to change. I guess, what are your feelings about it? And do you think that change can be made there, or is it going to have to come from somewhere else? And I guess I bring them up because they are such a big organization. They have been successfully lobbying for some things, just not necessarily, historically speaking, for trans rights or trans issues.
Right. Trans inclusive or not, I have to say I'm just not sure. I'm not sure how relevant HRC is.
Really?
They have their equality index, which I think is very, very important. Mm-hmm. And I would never talk that down. I think it is great to have the equality index as a way for corporations to just as a guideline for how they should be behaving.
Right.
And I think it's great that the equality index now requires companies to provide gender affirming treatment in their health plans in order to get a 100% rating. That is great. That is a great thing in U.S. society that is provided by HRC.
Right.
But apart from that, trans inclusive or not, I gotta say I don't really see all the good that HRC is doing directly.
Okay.
I've noticed they love to take credit for things, and they do host lots of lovely dinners across the country. And full disclosure, the Atlanta chapter gave me an award several years ago.
Okay.
Which was very nice. But it's organizations like Lambda Legal. In my case, I was represented by Lambda Legal in my lawsuit. Right. They are doing some really important, really groundbreaking work. And, if I have a few extra dollars to give to the cause, then it's going to go to a group like Lambda Legal or like Trans Housing Atlanta, which works to help find safe housing for impoverished trans people. That sort of thing, I think, is, those are the boots on the ground. Those are the people who are really making a difference. And I honestly I don't see HRC doing a lot of that shoe leather work.
Right. Well, I guess, and I guess I shouldn't be too surprised, given our discussion just now of the judiciary versus the legislature. Wouldn't expect someone to be that impressed by what is essentially a lobby group if we're not expecting a lot from legislation.
Right. Exactly.
Maybe it's not the best place to focus. So now we have discussed one half of why I wanted to reach out to you. The other half, of course, being you're writing on your blog, in the Facebook group, Skeptic Inc., and that is from from a more philosophical standpoint, you're a spokesperson for skeptic community and philosophical skeptic and skepticism, if I can say the word skeptic more times in a sentence. So tell me a little bit about that.
I would never call myself a spokesperson for the skeptic community, but I do consider myself a skeptic and a rationalist and a secularist. And
secularist, okay.
I'm as active in that community as I feel like I can be.
Right.
I haven't updated my Skeptic Inc. blog in quite some time, and I do feel bad about that. But I've had other things going on this year, things that I'm very proud of. But I did present at a workshop at the Amazing Meeting a couple of years ago out in Las Vegas, which was the conference that the JREF used to put on, the James Randi Educational Foundation.
Yes.
And for 3 years now, I've given a presentation at the Skeptic Track at DragonCon here in Atlanta. So,
what topics do you tend to speak on or focus on?
Well, it's a good thing you're sitting down because this might shock you, but I generally talk about transgender issues.
Oh my God, you're joking. No. Stop, get out. Okay. Well, how does that, I guess, because, and we're going to depart a little bit from the script here because, I was trying to hit some of the highlights, religion versus science, atheism and agnosticism, intelligent design in public schools, all the sort of the highlights of that. But I was kind of curious what the cross section is then between the skeptic community and the transgender community. Where does that become particularly relevant to you?
Well, basically, all the arguments against the reality of gender dysphoria and against the validity of a trans person's gender identity comes from the religious right. And when you unpack their arguments, generally speaking, they aren't really any better than their arguments that they make against homosexuality, for one, or against more expected topics like evolution, etc.
Right.
The religious right loves to compare gender dysphoria to anorexia, for example, or to claim that it's a mental illness.
Right.
Or to claim that sex chromosomes equal gender.
Right.
Etc. All of those arguments are pretty easily knocked down.
Right.
I think, and that's something I do a lot of in my skeptical writing and speaking. But also, you'll find that a lot of the people who claim to be arguing from a scientific point of view, generally, if you look into their backgrounds, you'll find generally some dogmatic religious biases.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Work there.
These are and there's probably a lot of crossover between there and the young earth creationists, etc., who also say, I have science that backs it up. No,
right.
You have sciencey sounding bullshit. That doesn't make it science just because you use the word chemical or atoms or, second law of thermodynamics, which you clearly don't even know what it is. I took two semesters of thermodynamics. I know the second law. You're wrong. God. Yeah, it that's a good point. Now, one of the things I was curious about, though, as you were saying that just now, and you would expect, like you say, just based on their general mindset and arguments, that, yeah, you're going to get transphobia from the religious right, just like you're going to get homophobia and all kinds of anti-science stuff, etc. It's very predictable. I had a guest on, again, earlier this year, Zinnia Jones, who had done so you know Zinnia.
I'm familiar with her work.
And she had done a video. It was an older one, but I believe it was a couple years old at this point. And it was talking about her encounters with transphobia within the atheist community. Now, of course, the atheist community is not coming from the religious right, but she was getting a lot of the same pseudoscientific arguments, basically repeatedly debunked misunderstandings, etc., intentional or otherwise. And I'm curious if you've had any experience with that, because yes, you can debunk the religious argument, but that's not as easy to do when you're arguing with an atheist who clearly is not going to come from that point. Have you experienced that as well?
Not directly,
okay.
I guess.
Okay.
I mean, I've traded hostile comments with people on Facebook, but
there's no hostility on Facebook. Come on, that's a bit.
There's not really any topic on Facebook that can't turn into an argument.
Oh. I mean, yeah, I once saw Godwin's Law broken on an argument about Willie Stargell. That one kind of blew my mind. I'm like, how do we get what? So anyway, kind of curious who some of your favorite writers are you like to read from philosophy or skepticism, etc.
I'm a big fan of Stephen Jay Gould. Mm-hmm. I've read a couple of his books. I've read particularly The Flamingo's Smile. Is a book that I really enjoy, and I love his essays where he has written about baseball in evolutionary terms.
I'm going to have to check that out. Was that in The Flamingo Smile?
I think so.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. He wrote about it more than once.
Okay.
But basically, the reason we no longer have 400 hitters is because pitchers and hitters in the major leagues followed an evolutionary pattern where they both got better over time to the point where it was just not possible for batters to exceed 400 season averages anymore.
Right.
And I'm not going to do it justice.
Well, no, yeah, but that's an interesting point because, because it either had to go one way or another. Either it was going to become the norm or it was going to go away, and it's gone away. And essentially, that's an interesting parallel to evolution. Huh. Mm-hmm. I'll have to try that I'll have to read it so I can do it justice the next time I'm arguing with a creationist. So, I bring this up and I ask that as a lead into the second worst spelling mistake of all time. This was about Richard Dawkins and Chris Hitchens. I'm sorry.
Wait a minute, I wasn't done.
I'm sorry. Go on.
We can't move on until I give a shout out to Charles Darwin. I know it might be stereotypical, but I absolutely love Darwin. Actually, it wasn't all that long ago that I read Origin of Species, but I read a lot about him. I read biographies of him, and there was a big Darwin exhibit came to our local Natural History Museum a few years ago, which included his desk, had a reproduction of his study, and a lot of his notes and specimens and such like that. And it's just, he was a beautiful writer. He doesn't get enough credit for the beauty of his prose. And his theory, natural selection is just, it's cliche to speak about a scientific theory as being elegant, but there's such an elegance to the theory of natural selection, and it has proved to be so robust and so solid against its critics over the years.
To the point that the only way you can criticize it or argue it is to completely misrepresent it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I've argued with many a creationist, many an anti-evolutionist, etc., again, usually from the religious right. And the amazing thing to me is I'm not even arguing their points. I'm not even defending evolution. I just have to keep pointing out that what they think is evolution is not evolution. That you're arguing something that nobody other than you lot are saying.
Right.
It's very infuriating to be losing an argument because the other person is too dumb to understand what you're saying. There's no way to lose an argument. No, but and I want to flip this around here because that's another lead into something I want to ask you about. But getting back to the writers first, and this was as I think I mentioned earlier, this was the second worst spelling error of my entire life. I was going to ask you about Richard Dawkins and Chris Hitchens, two guys who, from my point of view, when they're talking about religion, this is especially true of Hitchens, when they're talking about religion, I am hanging on every word. I love it. If they're literally talking about almost anything else under the sun, I'm like, oh my God, would you just shut the fuck up? Especially Hitchens, just such a douche. And so the question that I had, and this is for a little bit of humor for the audience. My question was, why do Richard Dawkins and Chris Hitchens have to be such dicks? And you were very confused when you got my notes and thought maybe I was implying that they were gay because I said, why do Richard Dawkins and Chris Hitchens have to be suck dicks? Very unfortunate misspelling there. Totally changed the point of the question. But I'm curious, I guess where do those guys stand on your, in your Hall of Fame of skeptical writers? Do you think very highly of them? Are you kind of where I am or somewhere in between?
I have to admit, I've read very little Hitchens.
Okay.
I think I've read some of his columns here or there, and I know he could be somewhat abrasive. I recall in particular his statements about whether or not women can be funny.
And Dawkins is not much more enlightened than Hitchens when it comes to issues of the female gender, shall we say?
Well, Dawkins has a chronic and apparently incurable case of foot and mouth disease.
Yes. Which is funny for a guy who, in so many cases, is such a brilliant writer and speaker in some ways. But yeah.
He really just needs to turn over his Twitter account to somebody else. I think if he only did that, then he would get along much better in the world.
Right.
But I very much enjoy Dawkins' writing. I've read several of his books. I read Blind Watchmaker. I read The God Delusion. And he actually makes a point in The God Delusion by describing a sequence from the Philip Pullman novel, The Amber Spyglass.
Help me out here. Bridge the gap for me there. I'm confused.
The Amber Spyglass, as you may know, is part of the Golden Compass trilogy by Philip Pullman.
Right.
And after I read The God Delusion, I lent it to a friend of mine and told him that as I handed it over, be sure you don't read this until you've finished reading the Golden Compass trilogy.
Was he working on it at the time, or was this just read that first kind of a thing?
We both delighted over the fact that Dawkins was a writer whose nonfiction would contain spoilers for a Philip Pullman novel. Maybe that's only funny to me, but I thought it was very funny and very indicative of the cleverness and the pop culture awareness and the overall accessibility of Dawkins's writing.
Right.
Which I think is just wonderful.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned a Charles Darwin exhibit coming to your local museum because another famous exhibit of scientific enlightenment going on right now, of course, is Ken Ham's Noah's Ark Monument. And, of course, that great Temple of Lies, the Creation Museum. And I'm just like, okay, so you've read Dawkins, you're a skeptic, you've written and spoken yourself on this. How do you even approach someone? How do you even begin to try to untangle that? How are we even supposed to confront that mentality?
I think the way Bill Nye did is probably a good way.
Yeah, but after that we walked away. Every skeptic was saying Bill Nye won, and every religious guy was saying Ken Ham won.
Yeah,
I don't know that it settled anything.
That's how that's going to happen, though. And you have to just take as given that that's going to happen and hope that there are people out there who aren't as informed, who haven't made up their mind about these things,
right,
who would watch that debate or read about that debate and realize that Bill Nye was the one with the better arguments.
Yeah.
That's the approach I take whenever I find myself arguing or debating with somebody. I never expect to convert or enlighten the person I'm arguing with. I just take it on faith. Well, that's an odd phrasing, but I just
no?
I take it on faith that somebody else might be reading or hearing our conversation,
right,
who will benefit from the true things that I'm saying.
Right. And I think the biggest bullet point from that takeaway is they asked each of them what would convince you were wrong, and right. Bill Nye just said evidence. Show me evidence, and I'm wrong. It's that simple. And Ken Ham said nothing. Nothing will convince him that he's wrong.
Yeah.
Well, right off the bat, I don't care what the discussion is. One of you is wrong. And I know which one it is before I even know what the topic is. Because one of you is thinking and one of you isn't. It's that simple. I mean, God. All right, I'm going to go a little bit off script again here, and I wonder if you've thought about this. One of my frustrations just seems to be the lack of critical thinking in education. That education in our country has become rote memorization and test taking, and regardless of how many facts somebody can regurgitate, we don't teach people how to think anymore. And as a consequence, we have a country where 40% of the people think the earth is 4,000 years old and was created in 7 days by a magic man in the sky. And those same people seem to doubt global warming too, which I kind of wonder what the connection is there. It couldn't possibly be political. But they would say, those same people would argue that teaching critical thinking skills to children was a form of indoctrination because, of course, they would end up reaching the opposite conclusion that those folks have reached. And I'm just looking at this going, no, critical thinking is the opposite of indoctrination. But we don't do a very good job teaching it, I don't think, anymore. Because we did, I took an epistemology class in high school. I took philosophy in high school.
In high school?
I did, actually. But I went to a private high school, so it wasn't a public school, at those years that I was taking that.
Was it a parochial school?
It was, actually. It was interesting. It was a Lutheran school, and my philosophy teacher is on record, in his lectures saying that he felt that Buddha was a more wise and more learned and more, better teacher than Christ. And this was at a parochial school.
Wow.
I mean, he was a cool guy. He was a cool dude. But I think of what I learned in that class, and it's not that you don't learn facts. You don't learn, you get a few names of philosophers and whatnot. That's not the important part. The important part is you learn how to construct an argument. You learn how to examine something. And it's amazing when I'm arguing with again, from the religious dogma standpoint, you're just going, God, you don't even know how to argue. You don't even know how to think. It's not even what you think that bothers me. It's how you think and the lack of it. And if you have the opportunity to enlighten the minds of the young people today, how do we get this in? How do we fix this? How do we get people thinking critically about these things as opposed to just repeating what their favorite politician said or their favorite TV personality?
Well, we need a better paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't claim to be an expert at this.
Well, neither am I. I'm just a ranter, but I'm curious to hear your rant.
I don't know. I think part of the answer to that is also political. You need to get more critical thinking people on school boards and other positions of power within local governments.
Right.
And that's part of a general problem with getting progressives to vote for elections other than presidential elections.
True.
People make a big deal about the presidential elections, but our local county commissioners and school boards, and
especially the school boards,
have much greater effects on our lives than who's president.
Right.
At any given moment.
Right. I mean, like I was saying, outside of the occasional Supreme Court nominee, the president actually doesn't have that much effect on you.
No, not really. And people also need to understand that we all have a stake in education. Mm-hmm. A lot of people like to say, well, why are you interested in education? You don't have kids. But we all have an interest in children being better educated. Because
right. We don't want to live in a world populated by idiots, for a start.
We don't. But even on an even more practical level, we want to get the correct change when we buy something at a store.
We want to have better products at the store. We want to have cleaner processes making those products. We want everything. everything.
Right.
And none of this is coming from the Bible. This is coming from science. This is coming from engineering. And if it's not coming from that, then it's coming from an understanding of economics and business and philosophy. Law, same thing, same argument. Although, hey, it sounds like we're waging a war on religion here. I don't know. Be careful.
Right.
Then here's a question within the education, because this is another one that I get interesting takes on. I'm of the mind that you can, in fact, teach creationism, evolution, and intelligent design effectively in the public schools, doing a fair service to each, provided that they're taught in the proper context. Namely, creationism is taught in a theology classroom, evolution taught in a science classroom, and intelligent design taught in a philosophy classroom. And yes, there's so many hours in the day, but that's kind of where I put these topics. Would you say that that's an equitable or a reasonable way to go about it, or would you take a harder line stance one way or the other on that?
No, creationism and intelligent design have no place in public schools
At all, not even in a survey of religion classes or as a philosophical argument.
Well, you're not going to get to classes like that before college anyway.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Well, but you're talking to somebody who thinks we need to.
Did you take a theology class in high school?
No, but because it was a parochial school, I was required to attend chapel once a week.
Okay, well,
I think they offered it, but I don't believe I didn't take it.
All bets are off when you're talking about private schools.
Yes, of course.
To begin with,
Yeah.
public schools, no.
Well, I guess, but I'm of the mind that maybe we need at least some exposure to philosophy and critical thinking and logic, etc. In the public school, and we don't have that. But I'm of the mind that if you're going to argue intelligent design, all of the arguments that I've heard are philosophical in nature. They're not scientific arguments. You can't test the hypothesis, so it's not a scientific argument. It's philosophy. It's chicken and the egg stuff.
I wouldn't even call it philosophy. It's so
Wow.
half-baked.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to teach philosophy in school, then I'd devote more real estate to Hume and Kant or the Greeks than to intelligent design. And what philosophy is intelligent design based on? It's not. I mean, it's a conclusion working backwards to a quote unquote theory. That's
right. Pseudo-theological apologism, basically.
Right.
All right, fair enough. No, that's a good point. I hadn't considered that. I guess I was trying to make a concession to those who won't let go of the point. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't necessarily come from, it's not a conclusion that's arrived at. It's a conclusion looking for an argument, more or less.
Exactly.
Interesting. I did have one other question. This was more on the personal level. So you had mentioned at the time that you were, and this goes back to the, so we're going to end if first things last, apparently. You'd mentioned you were transitioning at the time that you were fired back in 2007, but that you had already essentially fully transitioned in all other aspects of your life. But I'm curious, was that around that same time, or I guess I'm curious approximately how old were you, where were you in your career, and then how outside of work did people respond to that in terms of being supportive or not supportive, etc.?
Almost everybody I knew was very supportive.
Really?
My friends were all very loving and very accepting from the beginning. And it didn't take long at all for them to get used to the new me. There's nobody I'm friends with today, or there's no one I was friends with then who I'm not still friends with today.
Wow.
Yeah, but from all I've been told, that's pretty unusual.
I was going to say most guests do say that they generally had good support, but I don't know anyone that has said they've literally essentially still keep much of the same circle of friends, or still, yeah, that does seem to be unusual. Wow. Mm-hmm. You choose good people, apparently.
I'm very discerning.
In that case, we're done here. Vandy Beth, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on.
I had a great time. I'll do this again if you want.
Awesome. I'd like to thank Vandy Beth again for coming on the program. I had a great time talking to her. It was very interesting hearing about her experiences with the court cases, and of course, always up for talking skepticism and philosophy with a kindred mind. If you have any questions or comments about anything you've heard here tonight, or suggestions for future shows, guests, or topics, please send me an email at niceguy9418@usa.com. You can message me on Facebook if you friend me at Eddie Cabot or like my page, Nice Guy Eddie. You can leave a comment on my blog at eddiecabot.blogspot.com. And if you'd like to support IMHO, Rainbow Radio, and the content creators that we have on, please visit my Patreon at Nice Guy Eddie. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and keep on listening to Rainbow Radio.